Have you ever wondered what it takes for a man to become a living legend? Imagine a figure so terrifying that even the most hardened soldiers trembled at the sound of his name. This was the reality in the deserts of Brazil, where the land itself seemed to conspire with ruthless men who carved their own brutal empire. In the early 20th century, Vigolino Ferreira da Silva, known to most as Lampião, became the most feared outlaw in Brazilian history. But what made him so powerful wasn't just his ruthless tactics, it was the terrifying practices he adopted and perfected in the unforgiving Brazilian desert. Lampião didn't just fight battles, he shaped the very fear that surrounded him. His leadership was a mixture of violence, strategy, and a deeply ingrained understanding of the desert's harsh environment. And in that land, fear was just as important as strength. What we're about to uncover today are the terrifying desert practices used by Lampião and his These weren't just survival tactics, they were methods of psychological warfare, intimidation, and control that transformed them into legends of terror. From brutal punishments to guerrilla warfare strategies, these outlaws bent the desert to their will. Now, here's a chilling question. What happens when you push survival to its extreme? The cangaceiros, led by Lampião, knew this question all too well. The answer, however, may surprise you, because the truth behind their terrifying desert practices is something that has been hidden from history for far too long. And it's a truth that will change the way you think about this dark chapter in Brazil's history. Before we dive deep into Lampião's terrifying desert methods, let's take a look at how a simple man from the backlands became an outlaw who shook the very foundations of Brazil. This journey is one of unimaginable cruelty, defiance, and mystery, a tale where the line between survival and savagery is blurred. Now, think about this. What would you do if the desert was your only ally and your greatest enemy at the same time? Lampião had to answer this question every day of his life, and his answers, as you'll soon learn, are as brutal as they are effective. Stay with me through this journey, because what you're about to discover isn't just about outlaws, it's about how fear, cunning, and survival came together to create one of the most terrifying figures in Brazilian history. But before we go further, I need to ask, are you ready for this dark and dangerous history? If so, hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed because there's much more to come. You'll want to hear the entire story of Lampião and his terrifying desert reign. Now, let's dive into the rise of Lampião. In the vast, unforgiving landscapes of Brazil's northeast, Vigolino Ferreira da Silva, known to the world as Lampião, began his journey as nothing more than a poor, disillusioned man. Born in 1897 in the backlands of Sergipe, a state plagued by poverty, corruption, and lawlessness, Lampião was shaped by the harsh realities of his environment. But what set him apart from the countless other men who fell victim to the brutal cycle of poverty and violence? The answer lies in the very desert that threatened to swallow him whole. Lampião wasn't born a leader. He didn't emerge from a rich family or inherit a kingdom. Instead, he was forged in the flames of betrayal, injustice, and survival. His story begins in the rural, sun-scorched back, where the poor and downtrodden lived in constant fear of landowners, police, and the corrupt elite. In the early 1900s, the region was a cauldron of social unrest, where workers and peasants were often exploited and murdered by wealthy landowners without consequence. But Lampião, unlike many others, wasn't willing to remain a victim. He was forced to watch as the people of his village were oppressed, and his family was torn apart by injustice. His father, a humble farmer, was shot and killed during a dispute over land, a moment that would become the spark that ignited Lampião's desire for revenge. This was the catalyst. His father's death became a turning point in Lampião's life, and from then on, his quest for vengeance was unstoppable. In the face of relentless oppression, Lampião turned to the only life that seemed to offer any chance of survival, the life of a bandit who roamed the desolate deserts with an iron will, defying the law and authority in a world where they had little power. But becoming a cangaceiro wasn't a simple choice. It was a harsh and brutal reality that led many into a life of crime. Yet Lampiot was different. He had a vision. As he joined the ranks of local bandits, his brutal tactics and ruthless nature quickly set him apart. Lampiot wasn't just another outlaw. He was a man with a purpose, a leader in the making. His rise was meteoric, built on terror and fear, but also on the intelligence and strategic genius he developed as he learned the art of guerrilla warfare. His first taste of success came in the form of raids on wealthy landowners and corrupt police officers, raids that sent a clear message. Lampiot was no ordinary bandit. He understood something that few others did to survive in the desert. You had to control the fear. As he became more ruthless, his reputation spread like wildfire. But it wasn't just his violence that earned him notoriety. Understood how to manipulate his image. He became a symbol of resistance, a leader whose very name inspired terror in the hearts of the elite. People whispered about him, fearing him, but also admiring his ability to outsmart and outfight anyone who stood in his way. But what really made Lampiot stand out was his mastery of psychological warfare. He understood that to lead, you had to control more than just the land. You had to control people's minds. His ability to turn fear into his weapon was unmatched. Every raid, every ambush was designed not only to rob and kill, but to leave behind a message. Lampiot was unstoppable, and it worked. The Brazilian government was forced to send thousands of troops into the desert to hunt him down. Yet time and time again, Lampiot slipped through their fingers, becoming more of a myth than a man. The more the authorities tried to capture him, the stronger his legend grew. He was no longer just a criminal. He had become a symbol of resistance. People who lived in the desolate regions began to rally behind him, offering him shelter, food, and loyalty. His followers, the cangaceiras, were fiercely loyal, bound not just by fear but by the belief that Lampiot was the man who could finally bring justice to their forsaken land. But the desert, like the man himself, was unforgiving. Lampiot wasn't just fighting a physical battle against the government and the wealthy landowners, he was also fighting a psychological war against a society that had turned its back on the poor. His rise wasn't just a matter of power. It was a matter of survival, of shaping his destiny in a world that sought to erase him. And yet, what was it that truly made Lampiot feared? Was it his cruelty, his tactics, or was it something deeper? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover next might just shock you. As we dive deeper into the terrifying desert practices of Lampiot, we'll uncover the truth behind his psychological tactics, his brutal punishments, and the fear he instilled in the hearts of those who dared to oppose him. In the ruthless, male-dominated world of the Cangaco, where violence ruled and survival was a daily battle, Maria Bonita emerged as a figure who defied every expectation. Born Maria Gomes de Oliveira in 1911, Maria was from a poor family in the backlands of Bahia. Like many women in the Brazilian countryside, her life seemed destined to be one of hardship and submission. But Maria Bonita, unlike most women of her time, would not be silenced. She would become a symbol of defiance, and in doing so, she would change the very nature of the Congo. At a young age, Maria's life was shaped by the harshness of the Brazilian back. Poverty, violence, and oppression were everyday realities. But what truly set her apart was her sense of rebellion. In a time when women were expected to remain in the background, focusing on household duties and bearing children, Maria did the unimaginable. She chose a life of violence, danger, and conquest. Her story intertwines with that of Lampiot, the most feared outlaw leader of all. But what made Maria Bonita unique wasn't just her loyalty to Lampiot, it was her role as a leader in her own right, someone who transcended the traditional roles women played within the Cangacero bands. Maria Bonita didn't simply follow Lampiot, she became his partner, challenging the traditional gender norms that dictated the roles of women in this brutal world. She wasn't just therefore, the right, she was an equal, a force to be reckoned with. Together, they fought, raided, and lived in the desert, establishing their dominion over the land. But how did a young woman, born into a life of poverty, come to lead alongside one of the most notorious criminals in Brazilian history? The answer lies in her fierce spirit, her intelligence, and her undeniable charisma. Maria's presence within the Kangoko wasn't just about being the wife of Lampioshi, became a key player in the gang's operations. She was often seen in the front lines during raids, fighting alongside the men, earning respect not through submission but through sheer willpower and strength. In a time when women were expected to stay home and avoid danger, Maria Bonita stood out as an unapologetic warrior. But her rise to prominence wasn't without its risks. Joining Lampion's band of outlaws meant breaking all social conventions. For a woman to take up arms in the desert was unheard of, and Maria faced constant scrutiny from society. Yet, her boldness became her greatest weapon. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting to reshape the narrative of women in the harsh world of While men wielded weapons, Maria Bonita wielded power in a way no woman before her had ever done. Her influence within the Cangacheros was unparalleled. Maria Bonita proved that a woman could not only survive but thrive in a world dominated by men. She stood side by side with Lampio, not as a passive figure but as someone who was integral to his success. Her presence was so powerful that it often overshadowed the roles of other men in the group. In a time when women were expected to be obedient and meek, Maria chose defiance, and in doing so, she became one of the most influential figures in the Kangako's history. What's even more fascinating is the psychological impact she had on those around her. Maria wasn't just respected for her bravery, she was feared. Her role in the Kangako wasn't just as a fighter. She was also a symbol. She represented the untamable spirit of the backlands, a figure who could inspire both loyalty and fear. Her presence was a reminder that even in a society that sought to suppress women, one could rise to lead, to fight, and to change the course of history. But what exactly was it about Maria Bonita that made her stand out in a world full of hardened criminals? Was it her sheer strength, her ability to fight alongside men? Or was there something deeper, a psychological force that propelled her to the front lines of the Kangako? As we dive deeper into her legacy, we'll see how she used not only her physical strength but also her intellect to navigate the brutal world of the outlaws. Can you imagine the kind of life Maria Bonita lived, in constant danger, but with a fire burning inside her that refused to be extinguished? Let's take a closer look at how Maria became more than just a companion to Lampion. She became a legend in her own right. What happens when you realize that the true power of an army doesn't lie in its weapons or its numbers, but in the fear it instills in the hearts of its enemies? For Lampion and his cangaceiros, the key to their success was never just the power of their rifles or the ferocity of their raids, it was their mastery of psychological warfare. In a world where violence and lawlessness ruled, the cangacheros knew one simple truth: to control the desert, you had to control the minds of the people. This wasn't a battle of strength alone, it was a battle for dominance over the human psyche. Lampeo didn't just fight his enemies. He made them fear him before he even arrived. At the heart of the Kangako was the ability to manipulate and control not just land, but fear. Lampeo and his followers understood that the most effective way to destroy an opponent wasn't necessarily through battle, it was through terror. By sowing fear and uncertainty, they were able to destabilize entire regions, forcing not only the local population but even the Brazilian military to submit to their rule. The mere whisper of Lampio's name sent shivers down the spine of those who heard it, and the Cangaceros understood that fear could do more than a gunshot ever could. How did they achieve this level of psychological control? It wasn't just the brutality of their actions. It was the meticulous and calculated way in which they used terror as a tool. Every raid, every ambush, every attack was designed with one clear purpose: to send a message. Lampio's band wasn't simply conquering territories, they were breaking spirits. One of the most striking features of Lampio's reign was his ability to control the narrative. He didn't just kill or rob, he made sure that his enemies knew exactly who had done it and what would happen if they crossed him. The Cangaceros didn't leave behind a trail of corpses. Alone, they left behind stories, rumors, and legends that grew with every raid. These stories were often more dangerous than the actual violence itself. The fear of Lampio was fed not just by what he did, but by the fear of what people thought he could do. For instance, the Cangaceros were known to carry out brutal executions, often in public, for anyone who dared to defy them. But it wasn't just about the death itself, it was the public spectacle that made it so terrifying. Imagine a small village, its people living in fear of their next encounter with the outlaws. When the cangaceiros arrived, they didn't simply storm in. They made sure everyone knew they had arrived. They took their time, striking fear into every villager by displaying their cruelty for all to see. But it wasn't just about violence. The Congacheros used the environment of the desert to their advantage, turning the vast, desolate landscape into an ally. In a place where survival was already a constant struggle, the mere appearance of Lampio's men on the horizon was enough to break people's will. The desert, with its isolation and harsh conditions, became a symbol of both freedom and doom for the Congaceros. It was their home, their battleground, and their stage for psychological domination. Lampio's calculated fear tactics extended beyond the battlefield. Psychological control was part of his leadership strategy, and he employed it to bind his followers to him. The Congaceros weren't just a band of outlaws, they were a cult of fear and loyalty, and Lampio was their messiah. Understood the power of belief, not just in God, but in him. His men weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for a cause, for their leader's vision, and above all, for the fear that kept them united. But how exactly did Lampio use this fear to manipulate his enemies and his followers? One of his most terrifying strategies was his ability to disappear into the desert. The Congacheros were masters of guerrilla tactics, using the desert's vastness and isolation to their advantage. They were ghosts in the sand, striking when least expected and vanishing without a trace. This sense of unpredictability made them even more dangerous. No one knew where they would strike next, and no one could escape their reach. The psychological warfare didn't stop with his enemies. Lampio used fear to maintain control over his own followers as well. He knew that loyalty in the Congaco was often born out of fear, not just respect. He made sure that his men knew what would happen if they defied him or showed weakness. Punishments were brutal, and anyone who failed to comply with Lampio's orders faced public humiliation or death. This constant threat of violence ensured that no one ever questioned his leadership. Lampio's ability to manipulate fear extended even to his interactions with the Brazilian military. The government sent thousands of soldiers to hunt him down, but no matter how many soldiers they sent, they could never catch him. The fear of Lampio spread far beyond the desert, creating a psychological barrier that even the military couldn't overcome. His tactics were so effective that even the Brazilian army, armed with superior numbers and resources, found themselves powerless against the psychological grip Lampio had on the land. What does this tell us about the nature of power and fear? Lampio's reign wasn't just about physical domination. It was about mastering the human psyche, knowing that control over people's minds could be just as powerful, not more so than control over territory. And what makes this all the more chilling is the fact that Lampio wasn't just a man. He became a legend, a force of nature whose power outlived his actual life. As we move forward, you might wonder, how did this fear translate into actions that shaped the course of history? What happened when Lampio's tactics were put to the ultimate test? Stay with me, because in the next part of this story, you'll see how the psychological warfare of Lampio and his men led to their most terrifying battles. When we think about the notorious figure of Lampio, we often picture the terrifying leader of the Congacheros, surrounded by his loyal bandits, roaming the vast deserts of Brazil, striking fear into anyone who crossed their path. But behind the fearsome legend lies a darker, far more disturbing realities, the punishments and tortures that Lampio used to maintain control over his followers and strike terror into his enemies. To understand the full extent of Lampio's brutality, we have to delve into the psychological and physical torment that was an integral part of his rule. The Congacheros didn't just kill their enemies, they made sure their deaths were excruciating. Their punishments were designed not just to kill, but to make a statement, to terrify not only the victim but everyone who witnessed or heard about it. Lampio wasn't merely a bandit, he was a master of terror, and punishment was his tool. His approach was strategic, carefully calculated to create an atmosphere of fear and submission. His enemies, whether they were rival bandits, local police, or government soldiers, often met fates that were so horrific they became part of the mythos surrounding him. The public displays of brutality served as a psychological weapon, reinforcing the power he held over everyone in his domain. One of the most infamous methods of torture used by Lampiot and his men was the impalement of enemies, a gruesome fate that was not only designed to kill but to send a message. Those who defied him, whether through betrayal, disloyalty, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, were often executed in front of others, sometimes with brutal methods that extended their suffering over hours or even days. But the impalement wasn't just about death, it was a performance. The process was slow and agonizing, and the spectacle was as important as the execution itself. Lampiot would make sure that the entire community saw what happened to those who crossed him. Impalement became more than just a punishment. It was a symbol, a reminder of the price of disobedience. The psychological impact of such acts of public cruelty cannot be overstated. Yet, while the impalements were certainly the most infamous, Lampiot's punishments went far beyond just death. His band of outlaws engaged in a wide range of torturous acts designed to break the spirit of their enemies and instill absolute fear in anyone who dared defy them. Burning, mutilation, dismemberment, these were just a few of the tactics used to ensure that the message was clear, resistance was futile. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Lampiot's punishments was not the sheer cruelty of the acts themselves, but how they were used as a tool of control over his own men. The cangaceiros, though fierce and loyal to their leader, were not exempt from his wrath. Disobedience was met with swift and terrifying retribution. Even the smallest offense, such as failing to follow orders or breaking the cangacero code, could result in a horrific punishment. This system of fear and brutal discipline was what kept the cangacheros united. Every member of Lampiot's gang knew that loyalty wasn't just a matter of honor, it was a matter of survival. And those who fell out of line were reminded, sometimes in the most horrifying ways, that there was no room for weakness or disobedience in the desert. But what drove Lampiot to use such extreme measures? Was it simply a thirst for power, or was there something deeper at play? The brutal punishments were more than just a tool for maintaining control. They were also a reflection of the world Lampiot inhabited. In the desolate, lawless backlands of Brazil, survival was a constant battle, and the line between humanity and savagery was often raised. Lampiot's use of torture and punishment was also deeply tied to his own upbringing. Born into a world of poverty and violence, where the law was often powerless, Lampiot learned early that strength and fear were the only things that could keep him alive. His father's death at the hands of local authorities left a lasting scar on him, and it was this trauma that likely fueled his later brutality. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to dominate, to take control of a world that had betrayed him and his family. De cangaceiros. Punishments were designed not just to instill fear in the enemy, but to create a culture of absolute loyalty. Terra Lampiot, like many powerful leaders, understood the psychology of fear. He knew that the greatest way to maintain control over a group of men was not through rewards, but through the constant, looming threat of violence. Fear of punishment became the glue that held the cangacheros together, making them more dangerous than any army the Brazilian government could send after them. But what happens when you live in a world where fear is the only thing that keeps you safe? Is it possible to be both the hunter and the hunted, the oppressor and the oppressed? Lampiot's world was a constant struggle for survival, and the line between manipulating fear and becoming consumed by it was often blurred. As we dive deeper into the mind of this notorious outlaw, we'll see how the terrifying practices he used ultimately shaped not only his reign of terror, but also his eventual downfall. Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll explore how Lampiot's brutal leadership led to his legacy, and how the punishments he used to control others would eventually turn the tide against him. In the arid, desolate backlands of Brazil, where the sun burns relentlessly and survival is a daily struggle, the cangacheros found something that kept them going beyond just the fear of their enemies or the promise of plunder. They found faith. But it wasn't the conventional faith of churches or temples. The religion of the Cangaco was born from the land, the struggle, and the mysticism that surrounded their world. Lampiot and his men didn't just believe in God, they believed in their destiny. Their faith was a mixture of Catholicism, local folklore, and the deep-rooted spiritual beliefs of the desert. It wasn't a traditional form of worship, it was pragmatic, shaped by the harsh realities of the life they led. It was the kind of faith that gave them the strength to face impossible odds, the kind of belief that made them feel invincible, even in the face of death. For Lampion, the desert was more than just a battlefield, it was sacred ground. His followers believed that the land itself held mystical power, and the desert provided not just food and shelter, but divine protection. In a place where life was a constant struggle for survival, their belief system gave them purpose and direction. The harshness of the environment made them turn to mysticism, where every encounter, every battle, and every raid had a deeper spiritual meaning. The cangaceros didn't just follow a leader, they followed a vision. Lampiot's leadership wasn't only based on his ruthlessness or military genius, it was also rooted in his ability to project an aura of divine favor. He wasn't just a man, he was an instrument of fate. His followers believed he was chosen to lead them, and that his success in battle was a direct result of divine intervention. His survival in the face of constant military pursuit, his ability to outwit the Brazilian army again and again, was seen as proof of his sacred mission. But Lampiot's mysticism wasn't limited to his own sense of divine protection. He had a deep understanding of how belief could be used to control people, how it could bind them together and make them more than just a gang of outlaws. He understood that faith wasn't just about belief, it was about control. Lampiot's connection to religion wasn't just about worship, it was a tool, a weapon, a psychological force that kept his followers loyal and ready to die for him. Maria Bonita, his most trusted companion, shared in this belief. As a woman in a male-dominated world, Maria wasn't just following her husband's lead, was a participant in the mystical journey of the cangaceros. She believed in the same divine protection, the same spiritual power that guided their every step. Together, they led their followers through the desert, not just as outlaws, but as religious warriors, guided by a higher calling. The religious practices of the cangaceros were both fierce and intimate. Their daily routines involved rituals that blended Catholic prayers with local superstitions. They would pray to saints for protection, but they also invoked spirits of the land, asking for strength and guidance. The desert itself was believed to be a living, breathing entity, filled with spiritual energy that could either protect or destroy those who dared to live within its boundaries. This blend of faith, mysticism, and survival was the backbone of the Cangacos culture. Every member of the cangaceros was bound by these beliefs, creating a powerful sense of unity and purpose. It wasn't just about fighting against the authorities, it was about fighting for their place in the world, for their belief that they had been chosen to rewrite the rules of society. And Lampiot, with his charisma and conviction, became the religious figurehead that gave this movement its spiritual power. Lampiot's faith wasn't just about the supernatural, it was about his ability to inspire devotion and loyalty. The fear he instilled in his enemies was matched by the loyalty he earned from his followers. His men didn't just follow orders, they followed a sacred mission. And that sense of purpose made them willing to endure whatever hardships the desert threw at them. But what happens when a faith so deeply rooted in the land and the struggle for survival begins to unravel? What happens when the mysticism that has sustained the cangaceros starts to clash with the reality of their situation? As we move forward in the story, we'll see how Lampiot's deep connection to his religious beliefs and the desert eventually became both his strength and his downfall. How far can a man push his faith before it begins to consume him? If there was one man who could match the terror and influence of Lampiot in the Cangacos, it was Coriscoeman, whose name struck fear into the hearts of the Brazilian military and rival bandits alike. Known as the Lightning, Corisco was not just a follower of Lampiot, he was a force of nature in his own right. His ruthless nature, military cunning, and unwavering loyalty to Lampiot made him one of the most feared figures of the Cangacos. But who was Corisco really, and what drove him to become one of the most notorious outlaws in Brazilian history? Corisco's life, much like that of Lampio, was marked by hardship and violence from an early age. Born in 1893 in the backlands of Bahia, his early years were shaped by the brutality of the land, poverty, exploitation, and the harsh realities of rural life made him see the world in a different light, one where survival wasn't just about being strong, but about being ruthless. As a young man, Corisco was already showing signs of the cold-bloodedness that would later define his place in the Congo. However, it was Corisco's encounter with Lampeo that truly changed the course of his life. The two men, both fierce and driven by a desire for revenge against the world that had wronged them, quickly formed a bond that would define their future actions. Lampeo, always on the lookout for loyal followers who could match his ferocity, found a perfect ally in Corisco. Together, they would become an unstoppable duo, pair of men who dominated the desert with violence, terror, and a deadly sense of strategy. Corisco was not just a loyal second-in-command, he was, in many ways, a mirror image of Lampio, possessing the same qualities that made the Congachero leader so feared. Corisco's commitment to the Congacco was absolute, and his actions, both on and off the battlefield, showed the depths of his ruthlessness. He didn't just follow orders, he excelled in the art of war and terror. But what truly set Corisco apart was his ability to lead by fear. Where Lampio ruled through psychological manipulation and control, Corisco ruled through brutality and strength. He was known for his ferocious fighting skills, his cold efficiency in battle, and his utter lack of mercy. Many stories of his exploits are steeped in violence so extreme that they almost seem unbelievable, yet those who lived through them knew better than to doubt the truth behind the rumors. Corisco's cruelty was legendary, and it was a trait that made him one of the deadliest figures in the Congo. One of the most chilling aspects of Corisco's brutality was his complete lack of hesitation. While many of the Congaceros were known for their careful planning and strategic thinking, Corisco was a man who acted instinctively and violently. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, and he often led his men into battle with a kind of reckless courage that bordered on madness. This unpredictability made him particularly dangerous. He was a man who didn't think twice before slaughtering his enemies or committing acts of sheer violence. But Corisco was more than just a cold-blooded killer. Beneath his ruthless exterior, there was a sense of loyalty that ran deep. He was fiercely loyal to Lampeo, and his devotion to the Congacco was unwavering. It's this loyalty that allowed him to stand by Lampeo's side through countless battles, raids, and ambushes, never questioning his leader's decisions, even when they led them into perilous situations. Corisco's loyalty was what ultimately allowed him to gain the respect and admiration of his fellow Congaceros. He was a man who could always be counted on, no matter the cost. But what made Corisco's life so tragic was his endless cycle of violence. For years, he roamed the desert, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake, never once pausing to question the path he had chosen. He was a man consumed by his own rage, a man who had become so entwined with the world of the Congacco that there seemed to be no way out. Even as Lampeo's reign began to falter, Corisco remained a relentless force of nature, clinging to the only life he had ever known. His end, when it came, was as brutal as the life he had led. After Lampeo's death in 1938, Corisco continued to fight, but he was eventually captured and killed by the police in 1940. His death marked the end of an era, end of the most feared Congacero duo in Brazilian history. But even in death, Corisco's legend lived on. His name became synonymous with terror, and his story continued to be told for generations, shaping the very myth of the Congaceros. What made Corisco so deadly? Was it his fearless leadership, his ruthlessness? Or perhaps it was his unwavering loyalty to Lampeo and the Corisco's life was a testament to the power of violence, loyalty, and unrelenting commitment to a cause, no matter how brutal it may have been. As we reflect on his life, it's clear that Corisco was more than just an outlaw. He was a symbol of the dark side of the Congacco, a man who, like many others, was shaped by the brutal conditions of the desert and the relentless desire for revenge. His story is one of loyalty, terror, and the inexorable pull of Balança story that continues to haunt the history of Brazil's back. In a world where survival depended on strength, cunning, and sheer willpower, the Congacheros forged a code of conduct that governed every action, every raid, and every decision they made. This code wasn't written in any book or was a brutal set of rules passed down through experience, loyalty, and fear. To be a Congachero wasn't just to live outside the law. It was to be bound by a unique set of principles that determined everything from loyalty to betrayal, honor to punishment. At the heart of the Congaka was the idea of loyalty. For Lampião and his followers, loyalty wasn't just expected, it was demanded. The Congachero Code was not simply about allegiance to a leader or a cause, it was about survival in a world that was constantly trying to destroy them. Loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was a matter of life and death. Disloyalty was unforgivable, and the consequences for breaking the code were severe, often resulting in death or worse. Loyalty was not only to Lampião, but to the Congachero band as a whole. The Congacheros saw themselves as a family, bound together by the shared experience of fighting against the law and surviving in the hostile desert. Every member of the gang had a role to play, and no one could afford to betray the trust of their comrades. This loyalty went beyond friendship. It was a blood oath, one that was forged in the heat of battle and strengthened by the fear of punishment. But what happened when loyalty was tested? The Congacheros were known to be a tight-knit group, but even within the gang, betrayal lurked just below the surface. The rules of loyalty were strict, but the temptation to betray one's fellow outlaw was ever present. The harsh realities of the desert, the constant threat of death, and the promise of rewards for betraying the group made it all too easy for some to break the code. Punishment for betrayal was severe and often brutal. Betrayers were rarely given a chance to explain their actions, they were executed without mercy. Lampião's own hand was often the one that carried out the punishment, showing that even the slightest hint of disloyalty was a threat that needed to be eradicated immediately. This was not just about protecting the gang, it was about maintaining the fear that kept the entire system in place. But what about honor? Despite their violent nature and brutal methods, the Congacheros had their own code of honor. It wasn't based on chivalry or nobility, but on respect and recognition of strength. Those who fought bravely, who showed loyalty to their comrades, and who followed the rules of the Congachero Code were respected, even admired. The honor of a Congachero was tied directly to their loyalty and bravery in battle. It was a brutal honor, but it was honor nonetheless. In a world where few laws existed, the Congacheros created their own sense of justice and fairness, a justice that was carried out with ruthless efficiency. The concept of betrayal was equally critical within the Congaco's world. Betrayal wasn't just a personal failure, it was a threat to the survival of the entire band. If one Congachero betrayed another, the entire gang could unravel. For this reason, the punishment for betrayal was severe. The act of betrayal could mean death by execution or something even worse, an eternal reputation of dishonor that would last far beyond the grave. But betrayal wasn't only about the internal rules of the Congachero. It also extended to the ways they interacted with the rest of society. In a land where the law was often absent or corrupt, the Congacheros were both outlaws and heroes. They became the last line of defense for those who lived in fear of the elite and the military. Yet, they were also feared and hated by those who lived under their rule. The line between loyalty and betrayal became blurred, as the Congacheros' own actions sometimes mirrored the corrupt authorities they sought to overthrow. Their honor code was one of survival and strength, and it had a profound effect on their decisions. Every raid, every attack, every move was based on their understanding of loyalty and betrayal. But, in the end, the question remained: did their brutal adherence to this code lead to their ultimate downfall? As the Congacheros' power grew, so did their enemies. And eventually, the internal divisions that had once been held together by loyalty and honor began to unravel. The Congaco's legacy, then, is one of Pará. On the one hand, it was a world governed by an unyielding loyalty, bound by honor and survival. But on the other hand, it was a world where betrayal was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to tear the gang apart. Loyalty and betrayal were the cornerstones of the Cangaceros' existence, and they were both the forces that led to their glory and their downfall. As we continue the story of Lampio and the Cangaceros, the question remains, could they have survived without their code of honor? Or was it precisely this code, and the potential for betrayal it harbored, that led to their ultimate collapse? The story of Lampio and the Cangaceros has lived on for decades, growing larger and more mysterious with each passing year. What began as a tale of brutal outlaws' terror, Brazil's backlands has evolved into a legendary narrative that continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world. Today, the Cangaco is no longer just a historical phenomenon. It has become a myth, a symbol of rebellion, resistance, and survival in the face of unimaginable hardship. But how did a gang of ruthless outlaws, many of whom met violent and premature ends, become symbols of romanticized resistance? How did their story transcend the bloodshed and brutality, morphing into one of the most iconic chapters in Brazil's history? The answer lies in the way the Cangaco was mythologized. As time passed, stories of the Cangaceros took on a life of their own, distorted by folklore, emotional storytelling, and, of course, the desire to see them not just as criminals, but as freedom fighters. The image of Lampio, Maria Benita, and the rest of the gang was reshaped by those who wished to see them as the last line of defense against the oppressive forces of the Brazilian elite, the police, and even the government itself. This mythologizing process started almost immediately after the Cangaceros' reign came to an end. Even while they were still alive, tales of their heroism and cruelty spread like wildfire. People who had been terrorized by them began to tell stories of their exploits. But over time, these stories began to blur the lines between reality and fiction. As the years went by, the Cangaceros became larger-than-life figures. Their lives and actions infused with a mystique that made them more than just men. They became symbols of something bigger. The legacy of the Cangaco was shaped by the dual nature of these outlaws. On one hand, they were seen as violent criminals who sowed chaos and fear across Brazil's northeast. On the other, they were viewed as rebels who fought against a system that oppressed the poor and powerless. In this light, the Cangaceros' brutal tactics were reinterpreted as acts of resistance, and Lampio became a symbol of defiance against a corrupt society. But this legacy wasn't just forged in the stories of peasants and common folk. It also had a profound impact on Brazilian culture and identity. In a country where class divisions and social injustice were rampant, the Cangaceros became a cultural touchstone for those who felt oppressed or unheard. They were seen as the embodiment of the people's struggle, fighting for their own survival against a system that had stacked the odds against them. As the decades passed, the legend of Lampio and the Cangaceros grew. They became heroes of the poor, figures whose actions were romanticized. Despite their brutality, their lives were turned into stories, songs, films, and books. Brazil's northeast became a place imbued with the spirit of the Cangaceros, where their influence continued to linger in local folklore and cultural traditions. The mystique of the Cangaceros became so ingrained in the region's identity that it shaped the way people saw themselves. But why does the story of the Cangaco still fascinate us today? What is it about these figures, whose lives were filled with violence, betrayal, and fear, that continues to capture the imagination of millions? The answer lies in the complexity of their legacies. Their story combines elements of tragedy, rebellion, and survival. We are drawn to the humanity within the myth, the idea that even the most brutal outlaws had a sense of purpose, a reason for their actions. The Cangaceros were not simply criminals. They were symbols of resistance, of fighting back against overwhelming odds in a society that had little regard for the poor. In modern times, the Cangaco has become a cultural phenomenon. Documentaries, movies, and books continue to explore the lives of Lampio and his followers, drawing new generations into the legend. People from all over the world are still fascinated by the mystery and myths surrounding the Cangaceros. The impact of their story is so powerful that even today, their legacy continues to shape the cultural and political conversations in Brazil. But while the Cangaceros may have been romanticized in modern storytelling, it's important to remember the darker side of their legacy. The violence, the bloodshed, and the fear they created still leave a mark on the history of Brazil. For all the admiration they receive, there are still those who view them as nothing more than ruthless criminals. The line between myth and reality is often hard to draw, and the legacy of the Kangako is no different. So, what is the true legacy of Lampio and the Kangase? Is it a legacy of resistance, of fighting back against injustice, or is it a warning about the dangers of living outside the law? Perhaps it's a combination of both, a story that continues to evolve as we attempt to understand what these outlaws truly represented. As we reach the end of this journey through the brutal, fascinating world of the Kangaka, one question looms large. Was the fall of Lampio and his bandits truly the end of an era? Or was it merely the beginning of a new chapter in Brazil's history? Lampio's death in 1938 marked the physical end of the Cangachero's reign of terror in the backlands of Brazil. The government had finally succeeded in hunting down the most feared outlaw leader the country had ever known. His death, however, didn't erase the legacy he left behind. The myth of Lampio, along with the stories of his followers like Maria Bonita, Carisco, and others, continued to linger in the Brazilian consciousness. In a way, their legend grew even stronger after their deaths. The mystique surrounding them transformed from fear and hatred to romanticized admiration, and even to this day, the Cangacheros remain a powerful symbol in Brazilian culture. The questions that their story raises, however, remain unresolved. Were the Cangacheros simply brutal criminals, or were they the product of a system that offered little hope to the poor and powerless? Was their violence justified by the oppression they suffered, or did it simply perpetuate the cycle of terror that defined their world? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. While Lampio and his followers were undoubtedly violent, they also became the embodiment of resistance for the downtrodden people of the Northeast. They fought against the elites, the military, and a government that had abandoned them. And their actions, for better or worse, challenged the power structures of their time. Yet, as time passed, the Cangacheros faded into myth. The line between truth and legend became blurred, and the brutal tactics of Lampio's gang were overshadowed by the stories of their loyalty, courage, and resistance. Today, the Cangacheros are remembered as both villains and heroes, depending on the perspective from which you view their story. They were criminals to some, but to others, they were the last stand of the oppressed in a system that had long since forsaken them. The legacy of the Kangako doesn't just end with Lampio's death. It lives on in the folklore, in the songs, in the stories, passed down through generations. Even today, the Cangachero culture has a lasting influence on Brazilian art, literature, and music, with countless films and books dedicated to telling the tale of these outlaws. The mystique of the desert, the violent rebellion, and the romanticized figures of Lampio and Maria Bonita continue to captivate modern audiences. They have become icon symbols of defiance and rebellion, even if their actions were far from noble. So, as we reflect on the rise and fall of the Kangako, we must ask, what can we learn from the story of these outlaws? Is it a tale of tragic heroes who were driven to violence by the world around them, or a story of dangerous criminals whose cruelty left a scar on Brazil's history? Perhaps it's both. The Cangacheros were complicated figures whose legacy continues to evolve as we discover new layers of their story. Before we wrap up, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the legacy of the Kangase. Do you see them as heroes or criminals? Or perhaps something in between? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of the Kangako. And finally, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment with the phrase, "I'm with you till the end," to show your support. There's a video here on the side that dives deeper into the history of Brazil's most notorious figures. Click it to continue exploring with me.